Hello, everyone. My name is Nick LaFleur, and this is my project for inquiry. My project is designed for special education students, high school, usually early high schools when they take U.S. history. Um, Kind of the intention of the project is to give a lot of modes and different takeaways from World War One into World War Two and how they're kind of interconnected. Like I said, I want to provide my students a lot of sources. The reading levels can really vary, especially in a special education setting. Some students are at grade level, some are well below. So I just wanted to pass along tools and different ways to learn this content, whether that's videos or articles or different interactive notebook type of things. Without any further ado, my inquiry question, once again for students, were what were the direct and indirect causes of World War II in Europe, and what direct changes were made at the conclusion of World War II? So this is going to require a lot of background knowledge. So we start kind of into World War One and work our way all the way a few years out of World War II. There's a lot of connectivity between the end of World War One and how that was handled and the changes they made into World War Two. So I think World War One is actually a really big piece of this. This project is going to be divided into two. I'm going to do my source analysis of World War One and then leading up to World War Two, and then my source analysis of World War Two into post World War Two, with synthesis at the end and kind of those key takeaways that I'm hoping for students to find. So right away, I want to start with before the war vocabulary. So there's a lot. This is very content specific. So there's a lot of words kids aren't going to know, a lot of phrases kids aren't going to know that they will need to know. So there will be a lot of front loading, a lot of different tools for them to be able to learn these words. So assassination is a murder for political or religious reasons. It's in the World War One context, it would be Franz Ferdinand. It was kind of the kickoff to that. A province is like a territory or state. So in Bosnia, where this man was murdered, was a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Mobilization, that is moving somewhere. So in this context, it is specific to military. So mobilizing your military means moving it from one place to the next. A stalemate is a standstill. Once again, in the context of the war, it means that nothing's really happened. You're kind of stuck where you're at. Attrition is wearing down. That is something, once again, war specific. Attrition would be when your resources are getting low or your morale is really low. Isolationism, this will be a big one in World War One and World War Two, is kind of being out by yourself. So isolate, it's staying away from other countries' problems and kind of worrying about your own country. Tsar is a government leader. This is specific to Russia in this war. So it would be like a king in some ways. Communist is a political theory, and it's really based around heavy centralization of the government. The government controls kind of a lot of what happens financially across your country. Armistice is an agreement to stop fighting, or a truce, in other words, that we will see at the end of World War One and World War Two. Diplomats are a country's leader who works with other countries. Artillery or weapons like heavy weaponry, like bombs that are shot like out of cannons. Barren is kind of when something is like completely destroyed in this context, but like a bare area. So where the bombs would have went off in this war would have been very barren. The Treaty of Versailles, which was a peace agreement that marked the end of World War One. Set out to punish Germany for their involvement in the war. The Weimar Republic was a democratic form of government enacted in Germany post World War One, and we'll get into that with a little more detail later. Uprising is a revolt or a revolution against a higher power. So whether that's your government, a big company, it could be kind of anything. Inflation is the weakening of a currency, making it much less valuable. Depression is then the weakening of the economy, making it very hard for average people to be able to live. And then allies are people that are on the same side of the war. You can kind of think of them as like teammates. So that's a lot for the vocab. So I want to hop into the first article review I have, which is everything you need to know about World War One. So this outlines kind of the events that led up to World War One, the actions that brought other countries into the war, and then kind of the end and the armistice at the end of the war. It describes kind of Franz Ferdinand's assassination, kind of the start to the end. It's a series of a lot of articles, so there's a lot of different things that kids can pull from this. Another kind of important takeaway within this is done in the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia, and he was the heir apparent to the Austrian throne. So he was very important within that empire, and I think it really does a nice job explaining how Austria and Germany, which is kind of unique, in many ways consider themselves the same people, even though they are different countries, and even within this empire, they technically weren't all together before the war. They do see themselves as one people. So with that being said, they consider themselves their kind of natural allies. So once the war eventually starts off, naturally, the German and the Austrians, guess what? They're together, they're allies. This war goes on multiple years. It's a war of attrition. So we talked about resources, lives, people dying over multiple years. The cost of financially and human-wise is just massive within this war. As the war gets on, Russia's actually involved against Germany and Austria. What we see is that Russia kind of loses this war of attrition. They kind of back out before the other allies. And I think that kind of signals where the Russians consider themselves kind of, I think this would be important for World War II as well, where they don't consider themselves necessarily allies. Like they are the first ones out while many other countries are in. The USA actually ends up getting involved. Germany basically telegram Mexico saying that Mexico they would help them take some of their old land back from the USA. That got relayed to Mexico, and that kind of prompted the United States getting involved in the war. And then eventually Russia is the first one to actually sign a treaty with Germany in 1918. Once again, kind of going out on their own away from the other allied powers, so France and the United States and Great Britain. As we keep moving, so we eventually come to the conclusion of the war, and this is kind of the biggest piece of this, was at the end of the war, an armistice is made and a treaty is signed. It's called the Treaty of Versailles. This essentially blamed Germany for everything. The treaty stripped Germans' ability to have their own military, like a real military. They could have a military, but it was very small, and completely decimated their economy with the reparations they were forced to pay. This was a very large source of anger amongst the German people. So as I keep going, we're going to go into more detail on this next resource. So what were those challenges after World War One? So that's, once again, all of my headings are the titles of the resources. So we talked about the Versailles Treaty, and kind of the idea behind the Versailles Treaty was that there's this acronym for it, BRAT. Okay, BRAT is kind of how this treaty shook out for the Allies to the Germans. Okay, so the B in BRAT stands for blame. Basically, Germany is going to take all the blame for this, and it is all their fault, and kind of all the Allies were on board with this. The R is reparations. So this meant that they needed to pretty much pay back all the damages done in the war. It's estimated that in 1921, that number was 6.6 billion pounds. It was finally paid off, wasn't paid off until 2010. Obviously caused a lot of economic hardship. The armed forces is the A within the BRAT. And this basically said they could have no more than 100,000 troops in the army. no conscription. So conscription is like the draft in the United States. It would be like a volunteer army that they can kind of call on whenever they need. It's, like I said, similar to the draft, also similar to the National Guard in some ways, because you can volunteer as well. They weren't allowed to have any like heavy artillery, so they couldn't have any tanks. Their navy was reduced to 15,000 people, and they could only have 6 battleships with no submarines or anything along the lines of that. And then finally, the T is the territory. Germany lost a lot of territory, 13% of their land and 10% of their population. This will become important going into World War II. And these were big industrial areas, so it really, really destroyed the German economy. So after World War I, they're trying to make a new form of government. They decided on something that was called the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was democratic. They're trying to align themselves more with the Allies in that sense, with its own constitution. However, there were a lot of loopholes in this constitution and some kind of major governmental errors. One of the major errors is there's no limits on parties, so you had very individual, specific groups of people that have these parties. So there's, like in the United States, we have our 2-party system. There they had multiple parties, so you really don't have any true alignment within the government. This led to groups like the Nazis being able to gain some sort of power because there's only so many people within these certain groups that are getting elected, kind of dispersing that power everywhere. And then this is kind of the biggest error within this republic, was that the idea that the president in in an emergency could take what we consider executive action, complete control over the government. The big problem they had with that is they never really defined emergency. So we'll see as we keep going how that ended up shaking out. Kind of the last phase of this before the Nazis really start to take power is Germany basically, they missed a reparation payment in 1923. France and Belgium then took more land from them as part of that agreement. This led to a recovery plan in 1923 called Gustav's Recovery Plan. The German economy actually did start to recover. This, however, happened at a really bad time. 1929, we have this, or I guess one thing I do want to mention, as soon as they lost that land, the Ruhr region, when they missed their payment, hyperinflation went through the roof. So their dollar was basically useless. So Gustav's recovery plan comes into place. And then they're starting to build back. They're actually seeing good progress. And then essentially the Great Depression hits in 1929, and their economy is decimated again. So the World War I and the rise of Nazism. So especially after this hyperinflation, we see that people are angry. People don't have much. They don't have much to believe in. So that's kind of where Hitler starts to come in. He's a World War I vet. He's got a lot of charisma. People enjoy listening to him. And kind of all that anger and all the bad things happening in Germany, I think a lot of people just kind of close their eyes to it. This guy's selling me a promise that things will get better. So once again, that instability within the country kind of breeds these radical ideologies, really, that become accepted somewhat mainstream. So this one is a video. I do try to incorporate some videos throughout this. I'm not going to show the video here, but kids learn in different ways. Some kids really learn through videos. This is a good one. I'd really recommend watching. It's short, but very informative. So just a resource for you. So kind of the key takeaways I want kids to take from this, okay, was the Treaty of Versailles destroyed German economy and was a major sense of anger and amongst its people. They lost their land, their economy was destroyed, their military was destroyed. In a lot of ways, it was kind of humiliating to the German people as well, and specifically Hitler. So the formation of the new government, the Weimar Republic, had a lot of problems. Too many parties that didn't have clearly defined roles, rules, and regulations. So once again, that presidential overreach that could happen eventually does happen. The government also was weak. It showed it could, their uprisings could happen. Hitler was arrested in 1920 for a failed coup attempt. It just kind of showed the lack of strength. Many Germans, also territorially, I talked a little bit about how Germans and Austrians see themselves as one people in a lot of ways, especially at this time. Many people in Germany believed that they were being separated from their own people, with how those borders were redrawn after the war. Once again, lost 13% of their land. And then kind of the biggest takeaway is this hyperinflation followed by the Great Depression really radicalized people as they were really struggling to make ends meet. Their dollar was basically useless. A lot of people didn't have homes, didn't have food to put on the table. So a lot of things in World War I that kind of led to this World War II, this anger, quite frankly, the following of someone who was a psychopath. So World War II and the changes made after. So there's less vocabulary. There's a lot of overlapping vocabulary. So I trimmed this one down a little bit. So policy is the first one. That would be like a law or a rule for how something should be ran. Propaganda is a type of media to try to sway people's viewpoints. This is very targeted towards getting people to support your cause by showing certain things of either how great you are or how bad someone else is. Concentration camps were essentially labor camps and death camps. There was two kinds of them that were throughout Germany during the war and in their occupied territories that were designed for the outgroups within Germany and the countries that they had annexed during World War II. Superior means better than, or the perception of better than. We got to really think about how these people thought of them as superior. Aryan is a white, blonde, blue-eyed race that Hitler wanted. Currency is money. So in the United States, it's the dollar. During World War II, it would have been the Reichsmark, and now currently in Germany, it would be the Deutschmark. Occupational zones would be places that are temporarily being oversaw by a different country. So they're in this country making sure potentially nothing goes bad, or they're doing it to take it over. But it's where a different country is in an area of not their own country, overseeing everything that's happening there. So the first source analysis I have for this one is Adolf Hitler. So obviously kind of the driving force behind all of the bad stuff that happened in World War II, in Europe at least. So basically he was a World War I vet. You can see the picture on the right. That's a picture of him. He's actually from Austria. That once again, seeing the Germans and the Austrians as one people, that's kind of intertwines with that. He served in World War I, and he said it made him a lot more patriotic as a German. Once again, that overlap between the two countries and how they see themselves. After the war, he was kind of a struggling artist. Things weren't going great for him. He joined the National Socialist Workers' Party. This was really, he was drawn to it due to their anti-Semitic viewpoints. So the viewpoints that Jews were kind of the cause of all the problems that they had in Germany. He spoke eventually at beer halls, spewing that hatred towards outward groups and blamed them for all the problems in Germany. He started to gain power. He was actually very popular in these areas. He was a good public speaker. I think that was a big reason why he was able to draw so many people in. But in 1923, he actually tried a coup attempt to take over the government. He failed and was arrested only for a year. And this is actually where he wrote Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. It's kind of his memoir to all the hatred of his viewpoints and why, and actually eventually became required for all German people to have in their house once he eventually took power. In 1933, he failed a presidential run. This actually helped him a lot. So he failed, but he became a chancellor, which is similar to what like a prime minister in the UK would be. But so he becomes this chancellor, and basically what he used is his power as a chancellor to use violence against his opponents, political opponents, and kind of bend the rules and make new rules that really benefited him. One law that he made actually was where he needed no consent from Congress to make a law. So naturally, he made laws that really benefited him, eventually getting him into power. Basically, as soon as he got into power, he began ignoring the Versailles Treaty and began building a military. This, in a lot of ways, to the German people at the time was a good thing. Their economy was starting to recover a little bit. And once again, they felt the Versailles Treaty, just as a people, was very unfair and humiliating to them. Once he did create this this military, started invading different countries. Started with Austria. There's no struggle there. Once again, they kind of saw themselves as the same people. They just walked in, took it. It really didn't ramp up in the war until he attacked Poland. So once again, started with Austria, moved on. All of his speech was hatred towards Jewish people, disabled people, other minority groups, outgroups, in his opinion, were the blame of everything for him. Eventually, he attacked Poland, and then when he attacked Poland, that started to spur on France and the UK to get involved, some of the allies, and then eventually attacked on the Eastern Front into Russia, which also started a war with them. As he took these places, and in Germany, he made these things called concentration camps. And these were essentially work camps, labor camps, forced labor, and then eventually turned into just extermination camps where they were really just trying to kill people. People were used as slaves, they were malnourished, they were systematically killed. It's one of the worst events in human history. He eventually died in 1945. That really marked the end of World War II in Europe. His legacy, really comes down to the killing of millions of people, and that, with that being said, led to a lot of positive changes in the world today that we'll talk a little bit about later. So the Holocaust, that is that awful thing with the concentration camps, the killing of the people. This resource really gives a lot of background on that. So it happened from 1933 to 1945. They systematically killed people. It started with just shooting them. Soldiers mentally couldn't handle that, and they went to a more, not humane, but easier way for their soldiers to kill people by gassing them. Their goal was to build an Aryan race of all blonde, blue-haired German people, kind of a master race. So he enacted policies that discriminated against these people, and then eventually actually policies to eliminate these people. For years, they had this question of what do we do with the Jewish question, the Jewish problem? Not really the problem, but it was their perceived idea of the problem. Eventually, they came to the final solution of the Jewish question, which is just exterminate them, sending them to these death camps, putting them in gas chambers and poisoning them to kill them. The Allies really were slow to recognize this. 1942, they really didn't start to have an idea of what was really going on. So once again, that slow to react piece is going to be really important down the road in kind of the changes they made post World War II. So we talked about how after Hitler died, that and marked the end of World War II in Europe. So this article is how Germany was divided after World War II. They needed someone to govern, some way to split up the land. Obviously, the Nazis were out of power by this point. So they needed to do this. They needed to set up these occupational zones where they'd temporarily oversee everything that's going on. So the war ended and the victors needed to split Germany. The Soviet Union, US, UK, and France all split it. The countries met at this conference called the Yalta Conference, originally to decide the fate of Germany. These countries really wanted to avoid the post-war mistakes of World War I by just completely hammering Germany. They didn't want to create conditions that could lead to another dictator like Adolf Hitler. Basically, the decision was made to split the country into four pieces. The Soviets controlling one part, and then the Allies controlling the other part. More specifically, you can see in this image here, they split up Berlin. A lot of iconic history behind that. It's a conversation for another day, but you can see how it was divided there. So Berlin and Germany both split into four quadrants, so four different pieces. Basically, the Soviets, in their part, didn't really live up to these conferences where they said they were gonna not do what they did in World War One, and they really treated the German people poorly. Granted, there is some understanding behind that, considering how brutal the Germans were to them. So basically, the Soviets confiscated all German people who had land. They confiscated everything. They said that, claimed they were Nazis and confiscated them, even if they were not. So basically, they had to have another conference called the Potsdam Conference, because Stalin, the Soviet leader, was not listening to kind of what they agreed upon. So basically, their happy medium was the Soviet Union agreed to trade the food grown in their occupation zone and be able to sell it as reparations instead of just taking people's lands. Basically, they also didn't do that. In 1947, Great Britain and the United States decided to merge their sections of Germany and Berlin, and then France eventually joining. Western allies went even further to provide economic aid across all of Germany, and actually replaced their currency because it once again had hit inflation after the war, the Reichsmark, with a more stable Deutschmark. All of that was done without the Soviets. So a lot of tension after the war on the power struggle between the two ideologies, communism, capitalism, in those countries. Once again, we talked about in World War I how the Russians were kind of the ones that were out, they were the allies, but they weren't necessarily connected. We are seeing that kind of after World War II. So the end of World War II and the division of Europe, the photos there. The one on the left, I guess if you're looking at the screen, the one on the left is the Yalta Conference. The one on the right is the Potsdam Conference. Once again, these conferences were designed so that they could split up Germany and figure out how Europe was going to be divvied up. The original Yalta Conference was the unconditional surrender as well as the division. The Potsdam was more of coming back and trying to get the Soviet Union to listen to what they're doing. Poland also was reorganized. After this, a lot of Eastern Europe was kind of redrawn after a lot of it was Soviet Union taking over these countries. Not necessarily making them occupational zones, but actually annexing them and taking them as one of their own. basically, at the Potsdam conference, they actually finally did decide to, like I said, gave Poland to Stalin. Stalin said he'd do elections. Elections weren't exactly fair. He did agree to that, but he actually did agree to participate in the United Nations, which was a really big thing that came out of World War II to kind of prevent these things to happen in the future. This is very similar to the previous slide. The thing I really like about this one, the readability for struggling readers is a lot easier. The United Nations is created. So, United Nations was created directly out of World War II. The goal was to avoid another dictator like Hitler, avoid another event like the Holocaust, and ultimately to avoid another world war. That was the Second World War in less than 40 years. They did not want to go back down this road. A lot of people died senselessly. Financially, it doesn't make any sense to do that. Countries just get destroyed, and the dollar amount is very substantial. So originally, these countries met, kind of drafted up the rules for it. Really, the main principle is to be a peacekeeping organization. U.S. Congress, so if we look on the left here, that is all the countries meeting, signing the final charter. On the right there is the United States Congress had passed them signing into the charter, and that is President Truman right there signing the UN Charter. Once again, this was a direct cause and effect relationship between the Holocaust, Adolf Hitler, and World War II, and the creation of this organization, which still is going on today. This one's a video, so it's very easy to watch. Kids, a lot of kids, especially struggling readers, do like the visuals, and I think the more tools we can give them, the better. So this is more information on the United Nations. This is more recent, but once again, like I said, coming out of this, this is what we have now. So the United Nations is an organization, multiple countries, 190 actually right now, are dedicated to ending wars. They help countries with food, shelter, safety, etc. Just kind of a crisis organization that tries to come in and help. All the member nations belong to a General Assembly. They can bring up their own disagreements, and they can vote on what they should do to solve those disagreements. So instead of going to war, having those kind of diplomatic pieces in place. So major thing that comes out of World War II. NATO also comes a little bit after that. So this was written very, very similarly to the United Nations. Their rules, their regulations, how they act are very, very similar. NATO, actually, what makes it unique is we talked about after World War II how these lands started getting divvied up. NATO is actually designed for the spread of capitalism in this kind of land battle that ultimately becomes the Cold War against communism. Like I said, really it is very similar to the United Nations, with the one caveat of they're protecting the interests of capitalists as opposed to and trying to stop the spread of communism from the Soviet Union. So, synthesis and key takeaways. I think really the biggest takeaway from this is organizations were put in place to police and safeguard the world, that being the United Nations, NATO, etc. There's never really anything in place or a thing effectively in place until the United Nations. So that is kind of the big takeaway, is the world decided that they needed to police themselves. They couldn't let it happen again. And I guess another big takeaway on why the United Nations was created was large-scale wars such as World War I and World War II were just too costly, whether it's lives or finances. They're just too costly. They couldn't keep doing what they're doing and be prosperous, especially in Europe at the time that had been decimated now by 2 wars. Another reason was to avoid dangerous leaders and another Holocaust. Obviously, we haven't been able to completely avoid genocide since then, but to the scale of the Holocaust, we have been able to. So I'd say there is some success there and why that was created. And once again, kind of setting off those alarm bells when you have a leader like Hitler where they can meet and come up with a plan and solve disagreements instead of going to war. I think another big takeaway is after this war, kind of a new form of war comes, which is kind of the Cold War and how that was approached, where these major powers are going into different smaller countries and kind of battling and supporting these countries in order to promote their ideology. So it's one of the negatives coming out of the war is after the war, there becomes this massive kind of land grab and ideological war on who's right, who's wrong, and taking the power, especially in Europe, of all those countries. We see that leak over into Vietnam, other countries, Korea, etc. But really starts in Germany Germany and Europe coming out of the war. But geographically, I mean, the countries are different today because of what happened in the war. So also, I mean, without the catastrophe of the Holocaust, organizations like the United Nations might not get formed. So the Holocaust obviously being a terrible thing, but that might have been one of the good things that come out of it. But ultimately, UN's major purpose, avoid wars. And then eventually these smaller organizations is kind of the last takeaway, are created out of it. So it's to promote their ideologies, right? The NATOs of the world that come and are kind of in the basis of the UN of peacekeeping, promoting, but very skewed in their lens of who they're trying to protect and what they're trying to protect. So here are the sources that I use. So I had a total of 10 different sources for students to use and kind of come up with their own understandings. As you can see through the synthesis, there's a lot of things that come out of there. I think it's really important for kids to come up with their own understandings. Not everyone's going to hit every single one of those, but if they're able to look at these sources, figure out their own understandings, it'll be very beneficial. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and have a great rest of your semester. Bye.